There's a specific feeling I remember from being about 9 or 10 years old, sitting in the back of a car or lying in bed with a Game Boy, and noticing that the Pokemon world felt bigger than what I could actually see. Not in an overwhelming way, just a quiet sense that there was more going on underneath everything. An NPC in some forgotten corner of a route would say something slightly strange, something about an old war, or about how a particular Pokemon hadn't been seen in decades, or about a building that used to stand somewhere and didn't anymore. And I'd think, that's odd. And then I'd walk on and fight the next trainer and forget about it. But those details stick around. They accumulate over years and games and handhelds into this enormous background mythology that most people who grew up with Pokemon have only ever half perceived. A world with its own creation myth, its own catastrophes, its own ancient beings who predate human civilization by millions of years. That's what this video is. It's not a ranked list. It's not an argument about which games are best or which generation was the most important. It's more of a wandering, just going through some of the mythology, the lore, the strange details and the deep cuts at whatever pace feels right. The kind of thing you'd talk about at 1 a.m. with a friend who's just as into this as you are. A few things worth knowing going in. When I say obscure, I don't always mean unknown. Some of this is well documented if you've spent time on Bulbapedia or in certain corners of the internet. What I mean is the kind of thing that doesn't come up in casual conversation about Pokemon. The stuff that lives 3 or 4 layers down from the surface, past the starter debates and the favourite Pokemon discussions. The world building that the games drop in quietly and then never really elaborate on. I also want to be upfront that the lore in these games is not a tidy, consistent thing. Different Pokemon games have contradicted each other. Pokédex entries say strange things that seem to conflict with established canon. Certain myths in the games themselves exist in multiple versions, with details changing depending on who's telling the story or what era they're from. I think that's actually part of what makes it interesting. It mirrors the way real mythology works. Stories get told and retold, details get dropped or added, and what you end up with is this messy, layered thing that feels lived in precisely because it isn't consistent. The franchise is also, and I think this is underappreciated, willing to do things that are genuinely dark for what is ostensibly a children's property. Not gratuitously, there are no graphic details, no horror for its own sake, but the willingness to put the ghost of a murdered mother in a graveyard tower and to make her the emotional core of a whole region's lore, or to describe the contents of a Pokédex entry in terms that make it clear a creature was once a person who died badly. These are choices. Someone decided the world should contain these things. I think that decision was right. It makes the world feel real in a way that consistent cheerfulness never could. The franchise has been running since 1996 in Japan, a bit later everywhere else, and over nearly 30 years of games and anime and everything around them, an enormous amount of world building has quietly accumulated in the background. Some of it is in Pokédex entries, those little 2 or 3 sentence descriptions attached to each Pokemon, which range from "this Pokemon likes berries" to "this creature was once a human who now weeps over a mask of its own face." Some of it is in in-game books and libraries that almost nobody reads. Some of it is in NPC dialogue that most players skip through to get to the next route. And some of it lives in the designs themselves, each one referencing a real mythological creature or folk story that adds a layer of meaning underneath what might otherwise seem like a funny-looking creature with a funny-sounding name. What I find most satisfying about the Pokemon world's mythology is the way it keeps expanding in ways that recontextualize things you already knew. A Pokemon you caught in 1999 gets a Pokédex entry in 2019 that makes it suddenly sinister. A legendary you battled without much context turns out to have a creation story stretching back billions of years. The world building doesn't announce itself. It just sits in the margins, in background details and half-explained references waiting for someone to stop and actually read it. That's what this video is, just stopping and reading it, or letting it wash over you while you fall asleep. Either is genuinely fine. If you want to subscribe for more videos like this, the button's there, it helps. But for now, I figured the best place to start is also the most overwhelming place to start, which is the very beginning. Before any region, before any trainer, before Pokemon as we understand them even existed, let's talk about the creation of the universe. So Arceus, most people know the broad strokes. There was nothing, an egg appeared, the egg hatched, and the being that hatched from it created the Pokemon universe. That's the version you could put on a plaque. The actual version, as it exists across the in-game mythology of Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, and the Sinnoh era games more broadly, is quite a bit more interesting than that. The primary source for the Sinnoh creation myth is the Canalava Library in Diamond and Pearl, a building in one of the mid-game cities that contains several short books of Sinnoh legend. Most players walk right past it. The books have titles like Sinnoh Folk Tales and Veilstone's Myth, and they read the way actual folk literature reads, a bit stilted, slightly formal, the kind of prose that suggests something translated from a much older language. The central account goes like this. Before the universe existed, there was only a churning turmoil of chaos. Out of that vortex, over an unknowable span of time, a single egg came into being. It shook for a very long time, and then it hatched. The being that emerged from that egg was Arceus, and the universe, in a meaningful sense, began at that moment. Not because Arceus created it all at once, but because Arceus's existence was the precondition for anything else being possible. The first things Arceus created were three beings that would shape the universe's fundamental structure. Dialga, who was given dominion over time, Palkia, who was given dominion over space, and Giratina, who was given dominion over antimatter. Though we'll come back to Giratina because there's a lot to unpick there, and the antimatter explanation is more contested than it first appears. The Pokédex entries for Dialga and Palkia state something genuinely staggering if you sit with it for a moment. When Dialga was born, time began moving. When Palkia was created, space expanded. The implication being that before these two existed, neither time nor space was functioning. There was no before, because before requires time. There was no where, because where requires space. Arceus hatched from an egg, in conditions that we don't have words for, because the concepts needed to describe those conditions hadn't been invented yet. I always find that a bit vertiginous to think about. It's the kind of cosmological idea that sounds straightforward until you try to actually picture it, at which point your brain sort of gives up. After the creation trio, Arceus created the Lake Trio, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf. These three are smaller, quieter legendaries, and they often get overlooked in favour of their more dramatic counterparts, but their roles in the myth are foundational. The Canalava Library describes them as giving spirit to the world. Uxie brought knowledge, Mesprit brought emotion, and Azelf brought willpower. Without them, the physical world that Dialga and Palkia had structured would have been inert. The Lake Trio is essentially responsible for the fact that living things can think, feel, and act. The Pokemon world's creation myth is, in that sense, a very orderly piece of mythology. First physics, then consciousness, first a framework, then the thing that inhabits it. Now, the version of the myth in the Canalava Library has a conspicuous absence. Giratina barely appears in the most commonly known telling, and in some versions isn't mentioned at all. Champion Cynthia, who you meet in Diamond and Pearl, mentions while exploring the myth that Giratina seems to have been deliberately erased. Someone, at some point in Sinnoh's history, edited the creation story and removed one of the three original beings from the record. We'll come back to why that might have happened. There's one more layer to add here, which is a bit unusual to bring up, but I think is genuinely fascinating as a piece of context. In August 2024, Game Freak suffered a significant data breach, and among the leaked internal files was a document outlining an early version of the Pokémon creation myth. Planning material, clearly not finalized canon, and significantly predating Giratina's existence as a concept. The document describes the Lake Trio as having been born from the same egg, 3 beings corresponding to Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf. The standard Pokémon lore describes Dialga as controlling time and Palkia as controlling space, with Arceus as the primary creator of the universe, but does not establish humans as children of Palkia or Pokémon as children of Dialga. This document is not canon. It's design notes from a period when the franchise's mythology looked quite different, but it's a fascinating window into how the designers were thinking. That the distinction between humans and Pokémon isn't arbitrary or cosmetic, but is baked into the deepest level of the world's creation. They come from different parents in the metaphysical sense. Arceus, having completed the work of creation, entered a deep slumber. According to the Sinnoh myth, it remained sleeping somewhere in a dimension called the Hall of Origin. Whether it's still there, whether it ever truly stops watching what it made, the games leave that genuinely open. Pokémon Legends, Arceus, set in the ancient Hisui region that would eventually become Sinnoh, adds an important layer to all of this. It shows the creation myth in a period when it was still actively contested. The Diamond Clan and the Pearl Clan, 2 tribes living in Hisui, each worship what they call the Almighty Sinnoh, but they disagree fundamentally on what that being is. The Diamond Clan believe the Almighty Sinnoh is a being of time. The Pearl Clan believe it's a being of space. Both are right, in the sense that both Dialga and Palkia exist and are extraordinary, but neither clan has yet understood that the 2 they're worshipping are siblings rather than the same being, or that there's a third they're not worshipping at all. This disagreement leads to genuine conflict between the 2 clans across the game's storyline, and the resolution, both clans eventually accepting that the almighty Sinnoh was 2 complementary forces working together, not one, is essentially the myth being completed in real time. The creation story that the Canalave Library presents as settled history was a few thousand years earlier actively fought over. Arceus itself appears in Legends, Arceus in a way it hasn't in other games, communicating directly with the player character. The character is a modern person who's been pulled backwards through time, which is already a philosophically interesting choice. The god that started everything interacting with someone from its future. And the game treats this with a lightness that stops it feeling grandiose. Arceus has a project. It needs help completing it. There's an ancient hero it sends back through time to do the work. The player is a separate character from the ancient hero, though their actions in ancient Hisui may contribute to the legend. It's a surprisingly personal relationship with a being whose Pokédex entry says, "It shaped the world with its 1,000 arms." The plates that feature throughout Legends, Arceus, 18 elemental tablets that correspond to the 18 Pokémon types, are framed as pieces of Arceus itself. The theory that the unknown are Arceus's 1,000 arms gets an additional texture from the game, because the plates and the unknown appear together in spaces connected to the creation myth, both seemingly instruments of the same original act of world-making. Whether the plates are separate from or part of the unknown is another question the games leave open. And since we mentioned Giratina being erased from the myth, let's actually talk about Giratina properly, because it's one of those cases where the lore is doing something much more interesting than the simple villain framing suggests. Giratina's official story, as the games present it, is fairly straightforward on the surface. It was created alongside Dialga and Palkia. It proved violent and destructive. Arceus banished it to another dimension, the Distortion world, where it has remained ever since, separated from the Pokémon world proper. That's the story. Simple enough. But the moment you start pulling on the details, it gets complicated in interesting ways. Start with the Distortion world itself, which you can actually visit in Pokémon Platinum. It's one of the stranger environments in any Pokémon game, a dimension where chunks of land and water float at impossible angles. Gravity operates on an individual basis rather than a consistent direction, and the normal rules of physics simply don't apply. You can walk on the side of a cliff. You can stand on what should be a ceiling. Bodies of water exist sideways, suspended in mid-air. It's genuinely disorientating to navigate even as a flat 2D environment, which is probably the point. The official description of the distortion world is that it's a place where time doesn't flow and space is unstable, which is an interesting description for the realm of the Pokemon that supposedly controls antimatter, because, and this is where the fan debate gets interesting, antimatter shouldn't produce those conditions. If the distortion world were genuinely made of antimatter, you'd annihilate on contact with it. You and the air around you and everything in the environment would produce a spectacular mutual annihilation the moment you stepped through the portal. The player character navigates the distortion world by jumping across floating platforms and teleporting between locations. There are puzzle platforms. At one point, you fight a wild Giratina. That's not what an antimatter dimension looks like. The alternative theory that some fans discuss is that Giratina is actually a gravity Pokemon, not an antimatter one. The distortion world's bizarre physics, objects floating at all angles, gravity affecting individuals rather than the whole environment, makes a great deal more sense under a gravity framework. And the reason Arceus banished Giratina wasn't because it was evil or malicious, but because its gravitational forces were simply incompatible with a universe in the process of forming, while Dialga and Palkia were carefully structuring time and space into something habitable. Giratina's gravitational influence would have created catastrophic conditions, black holes, spatial distortions, environments where nothing could survive long enough to become alive. So Arceus didn't banish Giratina out of punishment, exactly. It moved Giratina somewhere safe, for the universe, and possibly for Giratina itself, while the difficult early formation period happened. The distortion world is a containment zone, not a prison cell. Giratina didn't do anything wrong. It was just too big and too powerful for the universe that was being built around it. There's something genuinely sympathetic in that reading. Giratina spent an incomprehensible amount of time alone in a dimension it didn't choose, separated from the world being built without it, because its very existence was too destabilizing for anything else to develop properly. It holds a grudge against Arceus that's referenced in the games. Understandably, I think. The distortion world's physical structure also supports this reading in a quiet way. Those floating platforms you navigate in Platinum, the ones at strange angles that seem like architectural mistakes, are widely interpreted by fans as Giratina's failed gravity experiments during its long period of isolation. The accumulated mistakes of a being learning, entirely alone, how to control power it was born with, but never had the chance to develop safely. The platforms aren't just landscape, they're the scars of centuries of solitary practice. By the time of the events in Platinum, Giratina has apparently learned to control itself well enough to enter the Pokemon world without causing the kind of gravitational havoc that would have been catastrophic during creation. Cyrus's plan in Diamond and Pearl, summoning Dialga and Palkia and using the red chain to force them to create a new universe, produces enough dimensional disruption to draw Giratina out of the distortion world and into the conflict. Giratina's intervention stops Cyrus. Whether it was acting out of a desire to protect the world, or simply out of an objection to having its dimension threatened, is left ambiguous, but the outcome is the same. One more detail worth mentioning. Giratina has two forms. Its altered form is the one familiar from Diamond and Pearl, the six-legged, winged, grey and gold creature. Its origin form, introduced in Platinum and available when Giratina is inside the distortion world or holding its signature Griseous orb, is completely different. A serpentine, almost centipede-like shape, with 6 long spine-like appendages instead of wings. The origin form is described as Giratina's true form, what it looks like in its natural environment. The altered form is what happens when it leaves the distortion world and has to adapt to normal gravity. The physical body actually changes to accommodate the different physics, which is a lovely piece of design logic, and also suggests that the distortion world's gravity-bending properties are genuinely fundamental to what Giratina is. It doesn't just live there, it's physically shaped by it. The role Giratina plays in the climax of Pokemon Platinum is also worth examining briefly. Cyrus, Team Galactic's leader, has spent the game attempting to summon Dialga and Palkia simultaneously and use the power of the Red Chain to force them to create a new universe devoid of spirit and emotion. He gets what he wants up to a point. The summoning succeeds, and then Giratina arrives through a portal, clearly furious at the prospect of its dimension being wiped away along with everything else, and literally drags Cyrus into the distortion world. Cyrus, who wanted to unmake the universe, ends up trapped in the realm of the being he'd presumably tried to leave out of his calculations entirely. The game frames this as Giratina acting out of self-preservation or territorial instinct. But there's a reading where it's something more. Giratina has been banished. It didn't choose the distortion world. And then someone tries to erase even that. The anger is comprehensible. What Giratina does about it, dragging the threat into its own dimension and keeping it there, is exactly the action of something that has learned to defend the only space it has. Cynthia, in the aftermath, speculates quietly that Giratina might have been protecting something. She doesn't say what. The game moves on, but the suggestion lingers. Since we've been talking about ancient beings sealed away in strange dimensions, there's a Pokemon that takes that idea in a very different direction. Something that's been sealed away not in a pocket universe, but in ancient ruins written into the walls themselves. The Unknown are one of those Pokemon that I think most people have a very definite opinion about, and then very rarely think about again. The opinion is usually something like, they're a gimmick, they're the weakest psychic type in existence, catching all 28 forms was a massive chore, and their single move, Hidden Power, a move that varies in type based on a Pokemon's internal values in a way that required a spreadsheet to calculate, was exactly as annoying to work out as it sounds. Fair points, all of them. But the mythology around the Unknown is a completely separate thing from their battling utility, which is essentially zero. And the mythology is genuinely strange. The starting point is the question that the Pokédex itself raises openly and then never resolves. Did the Unknown come before written language or after? Each of the 26 alphabetical Unknown forms corresponds to a letter of the Latin alphabet. The 2 punctuation forms, exclamation mark and question mark, were added later in crystal. The shapes are clearly not coincidental, but the games refuse to commit to an explanation. Are they ancient beings whose shapes human civilizations looked at and used as the basis for their writing systems? Or did they come later, taking on forms that mirrored human letters? Neither the in-game researchers nor Professor Oak have an answer. The question is left genuinely open. There's something pleasantly disorienting about that. The Pokemon world has an answer for almost everything, eventually. The Unknown are one of the few cases where the game explicitly says, we don't know, and that we includes the characters who've devoted their careers to studying them. The ruins of Alph are where most players encounter the Unknown first. They're in Johto, a sprawling set of ancient stone chambers filled with carved inscriptions, featuring sliding block puzzles built into the walls. The chambers depict Pokemon, including species that would have been long extinct by any known historical period. Nobody knows who built them. Archaeologists in the game world have studied them for years and don't have a reliable answer. Solving the block puzzles in each chamber releases Unknown into the area, as if the ruins were designed as a containment system. Which raises its own question, If someone built the ruins to contain the unknown, why? What were they afraid of? There's a detail from the Japanese version of Pokemon Crystal which didn't make it into the English localization, where a researcher suggests that the unknown started appearing at the ruins of Alph after the Pokemon Communication Center was built in Goldenrod City. They were drawn by radio signals, electromagnetic waves that apparently function as a kind of homing beacon for them. The implication that the unknown don't just appear wherever there are ancient ruins, but are actively attracted to certain kinds of transmission, communication, writing, things that carry meaning. The connection between the unknown and Arceus is one of those fan theories that's earned enough textual support to be worth taking seriously. Arceus's Pokédex entry in the original Diamond and Pearl states that it shaped the world with its 1,000 arms. A popular interpretation is that the unknown are those 1,000 arms, that Arceus's act of creation was mediated through or represented by 28 floating letter-shaped entities, and that arms in the myth is a metaphorical reference to the unknown's collective power. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, there's an event accessible through the ruins of Alph, a portal to the Sinnoh ruins, a site apparently built by people who worshipped both the Johto and Sinnoh legendary Pokemon. When an event Arceus is brought there, unknowns swirl around it as it creates an egg of a new legendary Pokemon, Dialga, Palkia, or Giratina, from nothing. The unknown are present for an act of creation. They're part of the machinery. In the third Pokemon movie, Spell of the Unknown, the creatures take on a different kind of role. A young girl named Molly, grieving and isolated after the disappearance of her father, who was researching Unknown, accidentally releases a group of Unknown that had been sealed. They begin manifesting her wishes literally, creating a crystalline castle, a physical illusion, Entei, a fabricated version of a mother. The movie treats the Unknown almost like a genie engine, vast collective power, with no governing intelligence, just doing what they're drawn to do, making real whatever desire they're in proximity to. They're not malicious, they're not benevolent, they just respond. And the scale of what they can produce, solid, interactable reality, suggests that the Pokédex's note about them being weak is measuring the wrong thing. Individually, one Unknown can't do much. Together, they can rewrite what's real. The Unknown research notes in Pokemon Legends, Arceus, set in the ancient Hisui region, add one more layer. The Unknown are described as having been present in Hisui for as long as anyone can remember, appearing at specific sites that seem to predate any human settlement. Ancient beings watching quietly, collecting in the dark corners of ruins. Neither dangerous nor helpful, just present, a mystery that the Pokemon world decided, fairly deliberately, to leave unsolved. There's a detail in how the Unknown function as individual Pokemon that I find interesting in the context of their mythology. They know exactly one move, Hidden Power. That move's type varies based on the Pokemon's individual values, the numerical stats hidden inside each Pokemon's code that determine its specific strengths. Hidden Power is the Unknown's only learned move, and what it expresses varies from individual to individual in ways that aren't visible on the surface. The move is called Hidden Power. The Pokemon is called the Symbol Pokemon. Everything about them suggests they're trying to communicate something, and everything about them also makes that communication essentially unreadable. The punctuation mark Unknown, the exclamation mark and question mark forms added in Crystal, have half-closed eyes in their sprites, in contrast to the fully open eyes of the alphabetical forms. The alphabetical Unknown are watching. The punctuation marks seem almost sleepy by comparison. Whether that means anything in terms of lore is completely unclear. It might be purely aesthetic. But in a Pokemon, whose defining characteristic is the question of whether it can be understood, the question mark form looking half asleep is either a coincidence or a small joke by someone on the design team. And since we're in Johto, and the ruins of Alph are in the middle of Johto, which is a region with more quiet tragedy buried in it than almost anywhere else. Let's move on to somewhere slightly north of there, somewhere with a very different kind of mythology. Smaller in scale, much more personal. Lavender Town is a small place. There's a Pokemon Center, a couple of houses, a man who lives alone and takes in abandoned Pokemon, and one very large tower. That's essentially all there is. It sits in the northeast of Kanto, slightly off the main route, and the game makes it clear, from the moment you arrive, that it exists for one purpose. People come here to mourn. The Pokemon Tower is a 7-story graveyard. That's not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It's a building filled with gravestones, floor after floor of them, where trainers and ordinary people come to pay respects to deceased Pokemon. It's one of the first places in the original games where the world explicitly acknowledges that Pokemon die, and that the people who bond with them grieve when they do. For a game aimed at children, it's a fairly direct piece of world building. Pokemon aren't just objects, they die. People build towers for them. When you first arrive in Lavender Town in Red and Blue, you can't progress through the upper floors of the tower. There's an entity blocking the way, appearing only as Ghost, a blank silhouette that cannot be targeted with attacks until revealed by the Sylphscope. You need the Sylphscope, an item obtained by clearing Team Rocket out of their Celadon hideout, in order to reveal what the entity actually is. What it actually is a Marowak. Specifically, the ghost of a Marowak that Team Rocket killed. The story pieced together from NPC dialogue across Lavender Town is this. Team Rocket were operating a poaching scheme near the town, capturing Pokemon to sell. They wanted the skulls that Cubone wear, which are, in a somewhat unsettling piece of Pokédex lore, the skulls of their deceased mothers. A Marowak protecting her Cubone was killed in the process. The Cubone escaped, the Marowak did not, and her spirit refused to leave the tower. She wasn't haunting the tower out of malice. She was looking for her child. She didn't know her child was safe. She had been killed by people with a stun baton before she could find out, and she couldn't move on without knowing. It's a very small story in the context of the whole game. It's about 20 minutes of playtime maybe. But it's the first time Pokemon does something genuinely emotionally direct, not through a big narrative set piece, but through the way a ghost is positioned on the staircase and what she's actually doing there. In the Let's Go games, the scene plays out differently. Rather than the player battling the ghost, Cubone runs in and embraces its mother. Marowak, feeling her child's arms around her, finally understands that the baby she gave her life to protect made it out. And she goes, just like that. No fight, no mechanics, just a resolution that works emotionally, because the ghost's whole reason for being there was never about you at all. Mr. Fuji deserves more recognition than he usually gets in discussions of Kanto's lore. He's an elderly man who runs the volunteer Pokemon house in Lavender Town, taking in orphaned and abandoned Pokemon. He was there when the Cubone was found after its mother's death. He took it in and has been caring for it, praying for it every night according to the game text. When Team Rocket occupied the Pokemon Tower, Mr. Fuji went in himself, alone, without a battle team, just an old man determined to stop people from desecrating a graveyard. They took him hostage. He presumably knew they might. He went anyway. There's a strong fan theory, well supported by supplementary material, that Mr. Fuji is the same person as Dr. Fuji, who appears in the backstory for Mewtwo, a scientist who attempted to clone his deceased daughter Ai using Mew's DNA, and whose work ultimately contributed to the creation of Mewtwo. The same man who was involved in one of the most ethically horrifying events in the game world's history later became someone who spent his remaining years quietly caring for abandoned creatures in a small town. Whether that's redemption or just the continuation of a life spent trying to make things right is left to interpretation. Now the Lavender Town music, because I'd be doing everyone a disservice not to address it. The original chiptune theme for Lavender Town in Red and Blue is genuinely unsettling. It uses tonal dissonant notes arranged in a way that creates a creeping, off-kilter atmosphere. It's effective. A lot of players found it memorable in an uncomfortable way, and it absolutely contributed to the town's reputation as one of the franchise's eerier locations. The Lavender Town Syndrome creepypasta, the story that the original Japanese track contained high-frequency, binaural beats that caused hundreds of Japanese children to commit suicide in 1996, is completely fabricated. It began as an internet horror story, probably in the early 2010s, and spread quickly because it was well written and plausible sounding to people who hadn't looked into it. The original Japanese music does contain unusual frequencies. There were no related incidents. It's a very effective piece of fiction, but it is fiction. The music was recomposed in gold and silver into something much warmer and slightly nostalgic, because by that point in the game's timeline, the Pokemon Tower had been converted into a radio station. The town had moved on, rebuilt, found a different purpose for that space. The graves were relocated to a smaller building, the Soul House, in the southeast portion of town. Still there, still tended, just no longer the centerpiece of everything. That's the detail I always find quietly affecting about Lavender Town in the second generation. The grief didn't go away, it just found a more sustainable shape. The Cubone Line's lore is worth staying with for a moment longer because it has a peculiarity that the games acknowledge and then decline to explain. Every Cubone wears a skull on its head, described consistently as the skull of its deceased mother. The implication being that every Marowak, in dying, leaves its skull behind as a kind of gift or relic for the child it leaves behind. The mechanism by which Marowak's skull became fused to it is explicitly stated. It's just presented as a biological fact. This is what happens in this species. Cubone is born wearing the skull of its dead mother. It cries at night while looking at the moon, mistaking its reflection for its mother's face. Some Pokédex entries push this further, suggesting that the reason Marowak carries a bone club is because it has internalized the grief of its mother's death and the sorrow of mourning its fallen companions. Marowak evolved its toughness and its combat capability directly from grief. The species became stronger because of what it keeps losing. That's a fairly brutal piece of evolutionary logic, and the game delivers it in about 2 sentences without blinking. The Alolan Marowak, introduced in Sun and Moon, is Ghost Fire type, which many fans read as a direct acknowledgement of the Ghost Marowak in the Pokemon Tower, incorporated so thoroughly into the cultural understanding of the species that it influenced a regional form 20 years later. The Alolan Marowak uses its bone as a fire torch, dancing with it in a style associated with Hawaiian fire performers. The ghost typing connects it to the spirit mythology of its native region, and to the persistent idea that loss and fire are inseparable from what this line is. The broader implication of Lavender Town, the thing that makes it unusual in the context of Kanto's generally upbeat adventure, is that it establishes early and quietly that the Pokemon world contains real loss. Not narrative loss in the sense of a dramatic story beat, but ambient loss. People and Pokemon have died here before you arrived. The tower full of gravestones exists because this kind of grief is common enough in this world to require a dedicated building for it. The existence of the Pokemon Tower is the game's way of saying relationships between humans and Pokemon are real, and they end, and that ending matters enough to mark it. That's the foundation that all of the Ghost-type lore and all of the mythology about what comes after builds on. Lavender Town is the first place in the franchise where the world stops pretending that nothing ends. While we're in Kanto and talking about ghost types, the ghastly line is worth spending some time on properly. Most people know these 3 quite well. Ghastly is the purple gaseous ghost. Haunter is the disembodied head with floating clawed hands. And Gengar is the grinning round creature that has been one of the franchise's most recognisable faces since 1996. Ken Sugimori, has described Gengar as his personal favourite Pokemon design, in part because of how simple it is to draw. High praise from the man who drew all of them. What's interesting about the design philosophy of this line is that rather than making all 3 stages variations on the same central concept, Game Freak appears to have drawn from a different folklore tradition for each evolution. It's speculative based on design analysis. Game Freak hasn't confirmed it in so many words, but the correspondences are strong enough to be worth exploring. Ghastly's most likely basis is the Japanese concept of the decapitated, flaming monk spirit, a disembodied head surrounded by spectral flames, formless and gaseous, associated with the unresolved dead. The Pokédex notes that Ghastly's body is 95% gas and can be dispersed entirely by a strong wind. The game does not use Ghastly's fragility to explain why ghost Pokémon haunt abandoned buildings. Ghastly genuinely needs shelter. It's not dramatic atmosphere, it has a practical reason for hiding in old houses. The wind would scatter it. Haunter's lore is a bit more international. The Bulbapedia entry acknowledges the likely influence of the dealer, a Philippine spirit that licks the life energy out of sick people until they die, leaving the body without ever making physical contact in the conventional sense. Haunter's defining characteristic is its enormous tongue and its lick move, which causes paralysis. The imagery is the same. There are also possible influences from the Japanese furei, floating spirits said to spread disease, which would explain the poison typing that the Ghastly line carries alongside Ghost. Something about the nature of these entities is fundamentally toxic, in a biological metaphysical sense. And then there's Gengar. Gengar is the trickiest to nail down, and has attracted more competing theories than the other 2 combined. The most formally acknowledged basis is the doppelganger concept, a dark mirror of something else. The name Gengar may derive from Genganga, a Scandinavian term for a ghost that walks again in human form, or from doppelganger itself. The idea of a creature defined by being someone else's shadow, someone else's reflection, forms the basis for the most persistent and elaborate piece of Gengar fan theory, that Gengar is Clefable's shadow. The 2 Pokémon have nearly identical silhouettes. Gengar's Pokédex entries across multiple games describe it lurking in darkness, preferring cold environments, all qualities strongly associated with Clefable. In the original game code, normal types and ghost types could not hit each other, an immunity that some fans interpreted as a suggestion of family connection, things of the same origin unable to truly harm each other. When X and Y introduced the fairy type and removed that immunity, the theory adapted. Clefable became weak to poison, and some fans now read Gengar as the spirit of a Clefable that died to a poison-type attack, its body corrupted by the toxin and reborn as a ghost-poison ghost in a form that mirrors what it used to be. None of this is confirmed by Game Freak, but the Pokemon Moon entry cuts across all of it with something different. It states that Gengar was originally a human, not a Clefable, not a general ghost, a person specifically, one who wishes for a travelling companion, implying there are more of them. That transformation from human to Gengar is something that has happened more than once. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games take this seriously. In Red and Blue Rescue Team, Gengar plays an antagonist for most of the game before it's revealed that it was a human who was turned into a Pokemon by the Ninetales curse. A long time ago, it grabbed one of Ninetales' tails, and when Ninetales attempted to curse it, it pointed at its Pokemon companion to take the blame. The companion was cursed instead. Gengar spent centuries carrying the guilt of that betrayal, unable to leave, unable to be forgiven. The creature built on doppelganger mythology, on being someone else's shadow, turned out to be haunted by the shadow of something it did. The broader truth is that the Pokédex is folklore, not fact, and what any region believes about Gengar may say more about that region than about the Pokémon itself. We'll come back to that idea in a moment. One more thing worth mentioning about the ghastly line's relationship to place. The old chateau in Sinnoh, the abandoned mansion in Eterna Forest, is one of the atmosphere-heaviest locations in the franchise. It has flickering lights, unresponsive doors, and ghosts that appear in rooms when you leave and re-enter. The ghosts there are explicitly different from Wild Ghastly. They can't be caught. They just appear and vanish. The game never explains who they were or what happened in the building. There's an old man in one room, a little girl in another, both of whom appear and disappear. Researcher dialogue in the area suggests that the mansion's owner died there under strange circumstances, and that Pokémon researchers have avoided the building since. The Ghastly and Haunter in the Eterna Forest are drawn to that specific location. Not everywhere in Sinnoh, that specific building, with that specific history. The implication is that ghastly-type entities are drawn to dense, accumulated grief or tragedy the way they're drawn to abandoned buildings. Not because they like neglect in the abstract, but because places that have absorbed a lot of loss produce the environmental conditions they need. Whether that's spiritual or atmospheric or physical, whether it's the cold, the darkness, the absence of people disrupting whatever they're doing, is again one of the questions the games choose not to answer. Since we mentioned the Ninetales curse, that's actually a whole other piece of mythology worth pulling on, because Ninetales has one of the more elaborate curse systems of any Pokémon in the franchise. Ninetales is a beautiful and slightly alarming Pokémon. It looks elegant and composed, very much like a creature that knows more than you do and is choosing not to say so. Its Pokédex entries are consistent across generations on a few key points. It is said to live for 1,000 years. It is highly intelligent, and if you grab one of its tails, you will be cursed for 1,000 years. The phrasing varies by game, but the consequence is most notably described as a 1,000-year curse in certain official entries, though this isn't consistently stated across all modern Pokédex sources. Not something bad will happen. 1,000 years. Precisely. The folklore origin here is the Kitsune, the fox spirit of Japanese mythology, one of the most well-developed and culturally significant supernatural creatures in the tradition. Kitsune grow more powerful and gain more tails as they age, with 9 tails representing the maximum possible level of power and wisdom for mortal Kitsune. They're associated with Inari, the Shinto deity of harvest, rice, and prosperity. They can be benevolent or deeply unsettling, depending on the individual Kitsune and the individual human's behavior toward them. They're known for intelligence, for very long lives, for illusion making, and for holding grudges across time frames that make human memory look brief. Ninetales is running very faithfully alongside all of that. Ninetales at maximum, 1,000-year lifespan, intelligence that exceeds human understanding, a memory for slights that would outlast any civilization. The Mystery Dungeon version of the Ninetales legend, which I mentioned briefly in the Gengar section, is worth going through in a bit more detail. The legend referenced in Red and Blue Rescue Team goes like this. A long time ago, a person grabbed one of a Ninetales' tails. Ninetales appeared before them and told them they would be cursed for 1,000 years. In a moment of panic or cowardice, the person deflected blame onto their Pokémon companion, pointing and saying it was the Pokémon's fault, essentially. Ninetales cursed the trainer instead, transforming him into a Pokémon. The human got away. The implication in Mystery Dungeon is that the player character, who begins the game as a human who has inexplicably become a Pokémon, might be the companion who took that curse. Someone else's cowardice became your 1,000-year sentence. It's a quietly dark premise for what is nominally a children's game. The central concept of Mystery Dungeon, that you are a human who has turned into a Pokémon and have lost your memories, gets a specific and unpleasant explanation that most players miss entirely because the game reveals it only through optional dialogue with an NPC who isn't blocking your path to anything important. The broader concept of curses in Pokémon is worth briefly cataloguing because it comes up more often and more specifically than the franchise's general cheerfulness might suggest. Yamask carries a mask that is literally its face from when it was alive as a human. The Pokédex notes that it sometimes gazes at the mask and weeps. This is not a subtle entry. Runerigus, Yamask's Galarian evolution, is a Pokémon that inhabits a clay slab, not a mask. Its Pokédex entry describes it as showing the horrific memories behind the picture carved into it to whoever comes near it. The form change represents the grief taking on a different physical expression. Same entity, different container for the sorrow. Banette is a particularly good one. It was a plush toy that was thrown away by the child who owned it, and the resentment and longing it felt was strong enough to animate it. It wanders, looking for the child who discarded it. The Mega Banette entry adds that its pure spite is what keeps it going. Not malice in the abstract, spite directed at a specific person for a specific act of abandonment. Curses in the Pokémon world, at least for this category of ghost, seem to require something personal, something that was taken or broken or left behind. Phantump is the spirit of a child inhabiting a tree stump in a forest. Children who died, lost, alone. The tree grew around what was left of them. That one is as bleak as it sounds. A few words on Pokédex entries in general, because this seems like a reasonable moment to mention it. They aren't consistent between games, and they're not meant to be. Different entries will contradict each other, sometimes saying a Pokémon feeds on life energy, sometimes saying it absorbs the emotions of nearby people, sometimes giving completely different physical measurements. The law standard most people apply is to treat Pokédex entries the way you'd treat an in-universe folklore compilation. They're accounts written by trainers and researchers in specific regions at specific times, reflecting local knowledge and local mythology. They're not the definitive scientific truth about each species. They're what people in that part of the world have observed, or believed they observed, or told each other across generations. The variation is intentional. It makes the world feel more like a world. Now there's a region that took this idea, that stories people tell about Pokémon are just stories, shaped by where you are and when you lived, and made it central to the whole experience. That's Alola. Actually, before we get to Alola, I want to stay on the topic of how Pokémon get misrepresented in their own lore for a moment, because there are a couple of examples that I think are particularly interesting. Absol is a Dark-type Pokémon that appears before natural disasters. It can sense impending calamity and travels toward populated areas to warn people. The Pokédex is quite clear on this. Absol shows up because disaster is coming, not because Absol causes disaster. Humans, not understanding this, have hunted and feared Absol for centuries because they made the correlation the wrong way round. The creature that was trying to save villages has been driven into remote mountains because it kept getting blamed for the earthquakes and storms it was running ahead of. That's a quietly devastating piece of lore. The monster of the legend was the messenger. Zorok and Zorua tap into Kitsune mythology, fox spirits capable of illusion and shape-shifting, but with a wrinkle. Zoroark's illusions are specifically used to protect its pack, particularly its young. It will create elaborate false landscapes, entire villages that don't exist, to lead people away from wherever its Zorua are hiding. Pokédex entries describe trainers who wandered into illusions and were trapped in them, believing they were in a real place until the illusion dissolved. The framing is slightly ominous, but Zoroark is not malicious, it's protective. Its hostile illusions are created in defense of those close to it, including both small and vulnerable members like Zorua, as well as its broader pack. The threatening creature is apparent. That seems like the right note to end this brief detour on. Now Alola. Actually, one more thing before we get there. Since this is a sleep video, and I haven't yet mentioned the Pokémon most directly relevant to sleep, it feels like an oversight. Drowsy and Hypno eat dreams. That's their established function in the Pokémon world. Drowsy, the tapir-shaped psychic type from the original games, locates sleeping people and Pokémon and consumes their dreams. Its Pokédex entries describe it as preferring the tastier dreams of children. Hypno, its evolution, carries a pendulum it swings to hypnotize targets and put them to sleep, and then feeds on whatever dreams it induces. The entries in later games mention that people hypnotized by Hypno have been known to follow it home in a trance, and that it sometimes steals children. The Torpor inspiration here is the Baku, a Japanese mythological creature that eats nightmares. The Baku is traditionally invoked before sleep as a protective measure. You call its name so that it will come and consume any bad dreams you have. The concept is genuinely benign in the original folklore. The Drowsy line took the dream-eating aspect and applied it to all dreams, not just nightmares, and then added the children detail, which shifts the register considerably. The Munna and Mushana line from Generation 5 is a lighter take on the same concept. Munna floats around emitting dream mist, the collected dream substance of Pokémon and people who have fallen asleep nearby. The Pokédex describes Mushana as releasing dark mists that can cause nightmares to become reality and warns against getting too near. It eats dreams too, but the framing is gentle. It absorbs the residue of sleep and releases it as soft-coloured vapour. There are Mushana sleeping in various locations across Unova, and trainers are described as watching the dream mist to see what their Pokémon are dreaming about. The contrast between Hypno and Mushana is a neat example of how the Pokémon world handles the same concept across generations. Gen 1 was often blunter and more unsettling. The children detail in Hypno's entry feels like something that simply wouldn't be written the same way in a modern entry. Mushana took the same dream-eating idea and made something softer and more wistful from it. Both versions are honest about what these Pokémon do, they just have different relationships to the darkness in it. Alola is the Hawaiian-inspired region from Sun and Moon, and it does something that I think makes it distinct from every other region in the franchise. It treats its own mythology with a visible degree of uncertainty. The people of Alola are aware that their legends are legends. Characters in the game distinguish between what the old stories say and what researchers currently believe. The local professor, Kukui, is genuinely interested in reconciling the two. There's a lived-in quality to the way the region thinks about its own history that feels more honest than the treatment in some other games where legendary Pokémon mythology is presented as essentially factual. The Tapu Guardians, Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Bulu, and Tapu Fini are the island deities of Alola's 4 main islands. Each protects its island and governs a natural force corresponding to its island's dominant terrain. Their designs draw explicitly from Hawaiian and broader Polynesian traditions of Akua, divine beings associated with specific natural forces, demanding respect rather than worship, unpredictable by human standards, not interested in being petitioned so much as acknowledged. Each of the Tapus has its own story and its own relationship to its island, and none of them are straightforwardly good or bad. Tapu Bulu, the grass deity of Ula Ula Island, became furious at the development and urbanization of what had been sacred land on its island, and destroyed the village that stood there, leaving only a Pokémon Center standing. The thrifty Megamart that was later built on the same site became a ghost-type trial location, haunted, presumably, because of what Tapu Bulu did. The deity isn't punished for this. Nobody expects it to apologize. It had dominion over that land. Humans built on it without properly respecting what they were building on. The destruction is framed as a consequence, not a crime. That's a fairly sophisticated piece of myth-making for a game primarily aimed at younger players. The founding myth of Alola itself involves 3 beings, Solgaleo, Lunala, and a third whose name the ancient people gave as the Blinding One. The Blinding One was Necrozma, and its light was the brightest. It filled the region with light and nourishment. At some point, a conflict between the Blinding One and the humans of Alola resulted in Necrozma losing its light. Whether it was taken or drained or simply used up in the process of providing, the accounts are unclear. What's left is the Necrozma the player encounters in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, a cracked, dark, crystalline creature that looks like something shattered and imperfectly reassembled, described in its Pokédex entry as being in constant, eternal pain. The Ultra Necrozma form, achieved when Necrozma fuses with either Solgaleo or Lunala and reclaims its full light, is a massive, golden, radiant being. Looking at the two forms side by side is a fairly striking contrast. One is a broken fragment. The other is what it used to be. The games don't resolve which direction Necrozma is heading, whether it's recovering or simply borrowing light it can't sustain. Now there's a Pokemon in Alola whose backstory goes in a completely different direction from Guardian Deity mythology, and it's one I want to mention because it represents something the franchise does, occasionally, that catches you off guard, making something genuinely disturbing. Type Null, a chimeric Pokemon created by the Ether Foundation using the DNA of all known Pokemon types, specifically engineered to be capable of countering Ultra Beasts, beings from other dimensions that exist outside the normal type system. The idea was to create a weapon, a single Pokemon that, when evolved into Silvally, could change its typing based on held items, adapting to whatever threat appeared from the Ultra Wormholes. Type Null is described as a beast killer. The project was called Project Cerberus. 3 prototypes were created. The process was horrifying enough that all 3 went berserk during development. 2 were destroyed. The one fitted with a heavy mask suppresses its power and contains it, essentially lobotomizing it to keep it manageable. When you find Type Null in Sun and Moon, it's wearing that mask. It can barely move properly. Its stats are mediocre, and there's a specific mechanic. If Type Null trusts its trainer enough, it evolves into Silvally. The mask breaks. The creature that was built as a weapon, that was compressed and suppressed and nearly destroyed to make it controllable, gets to just be a Pokemon. It's a small arc tucked into the postgame of a game that has a lot going on, but the detail that it required raising its friendship level and then leveling up to evolve, rather than simply reaching a level, like most Pokemon, is the game communicating something specific about what kind of transformation that is. It's not just growing stronger, it's becoming free. Before leaving Alola, there's one more piece of its mythology worth mentioning, because I think it genuinely changes how you read the region's tone. The Ultra Beasts, beings from other dimensions that arrive through Ultra Wormholes, are treated by the people of Alola with fear. The game calls them UBs and assigns them identification numbers, which is a deliberately clinical framing for what are, in several cases, beings of extraordinary beauty and emotional complexity. UB01 symbiont, Nihiligo, is a jellyfish-like creature that bonds with other beings and injects venom to make the host obey. But it also, in the game's lore, produces euphoria in whoever it bonds with. Lusamine, the main antagonist of Sun and Moon, fuses with a Nihiligo and describes the experience as happiness she's never felt elsewhere. The game is careful to distinguish this from a positive thing. The venom is poisoning her. The happiness is not real. The creature is not her friend. But the detail that it produces genuine subjective bliss is troubling in a specific and interesting way. The Ultra Beasts are not simply monsters from another dimension. They're alien minds operating on alien values, and the harm they do is not always intentional. Each Ultra Beast corresponds roughly to a specific human quality stripped to its extreme or missing entirely. Xurkitree is electricity without purpose. Buzzwole is strength without self-awareness. Guzzlord is hunger without limit. They feel less like enemies and more like mirrors, showing what any quality looks like when you remove everything that regulates it. And the connection between that idea, something shaped for a specific purpose, unable to be more than that, comes up in Kalos in the most explicit and historical way. Pokemon X and Y are set in Kalos, which is based on France, and the region has a quality that I think distinguishes it from most of the others. There's a real elegance to the landscape and the mythology, and underneath that elegance there's something genuinely awful that happened a long time ago, and that the entire region has been living in the shadow of ever since. Throughout X and Y, the player keeps encountering a giant of a man. Quite literally giant, he's several meters taller than any other character in the game, with white hair and a blank, faraway expression. He gives his name as AZ. He doesn't explain himself. He appears at various points across Kalos, always seemingly looking for something. The game never tells you who he is until very near the end. The reveal is this: 3,000 years before the events of X and Y, AZ was a king. He had a beloved Floette, a small fairy-type Pokemon, one of those delicate creatures that looks like it should be decorating a greeting card. This Floette fought in the war that was spreading across Kalos at the time. She died. AZ was destroyed by grief. He was a king who had resources and engineering capability, and he used them the way people occasionally use the things they're good at when grief removes any proportional sense of consequence. He built a machine, the ultimate weapon, a device capable of collecting and redirecting enormous amounts of life energy. He designed it specifically to bring his Floette back, and it worked. He got her back. And then, still consumed by rage and despair, and unable to reconcile the fact that his beloved had been killed by a war he hadn't been able to stop, he used the machine in reverse. Instead of giving life, it took it. He fired the weapon across Kalos, draining the lives of Pokemon on both sides of the conflict, enormous numbers of them, to end the war through destruction. The war stopped because there was nothing left to fight for. Floette, seeing what her trainer had done in her name, left. She had been restored to life at the cost of other lives, and she wanted no part of what AZ had become. She disappeared from AZ, but later rejoined him at the conclusion of X and Y. AZ, because of what the weapon's energy had done to him in the process of using it, became functionally immortal, unable to age, unable to die, unable to move forward. He spent 3,000 years wandering the world, looking for a small fairy Pokemon with a flower. At the very end of X and Y, after everything else has concluded, the villain defeated, the threat resolved, the credits almost ready to roll, AZ comes down to the plaza, outside the final Pokemon League, and something floats down from the sky, into his hands. His Floette, after 3,000 years. The game gives you about 15 seconds of this. There is an explanation of where she's been and why she's come back. She died 3,000 years ago in war and was resurrected by AZ's machine. Then they leave together, quietly, and that's the end of their story. I think it's one of the best handled emotional moments in the franchise, precisely because of how understated it is. The game doesn't make a big deal of it. It doesn't swell with music and slow down for close-ups. It just happens simply, and then it's over. Professor Sycamore, the region's Pokemon professor, theorizes that Mega Evolution, the temporary power-up mechanic central to X and Y's competitive system, might be a direct side effect of the ultimate weapon. The weapon gathered and released enormous amounts of energy, possibly from Xerneas and Yveltal, the two legendary Pokemon associated with life and death in Kalos, and that energy may have spread through the region's keystones and megastones, altering how Pokemon respond to the bond with their trainers during battle. This is speculative in the game. Sycamore presents it as a theory, not a conclusion, but if it's right, it means the most powerful competitive mechanic of the 6th generation is a scar left by an act of mass destruction, driven by one man's grief. Something worth noting about the Kalos War itself. The game never tells you who was fighting, or why, or who the factions were. AZ ended it, but what caused it, what the sides wanted, what the conflict was actually about, none of it is explained. It's a very deliberate choice. The war exists in X and Y purely as background context for AZ's story, not as history to be understood in its own right. The reasons don't matter. The consequences are everything. There's a connection between AZ and the actual villain of X and Y, Lysandra, that the game implies but doesn't fully explore. Lysandra, who leads Team Flare and intends to use the restored ultimate weapon to wipe out everyone he considers unworthy, is in some ways a dark reflection of AZ. AZ used the weapon out of grief and private loss for the sake of one specific creature he loved. Lysandra uses the philosophical descendant of that same act for an abstract ideological purpose. Beauty, as he defines it, versus decay. What I find genuinely uncomfortable about that parallel is how clean it is. The escalation from "I did something terrible for love" to "I will do something terrible for an idea" feels like a very honest account of how atrocities usually develop. Love becomes ideology. The personal becomes the programmatic. The game also touches quietly on the Pokemon who died to power the ultimate weapon the first time. Professor Sycamore mentions their graves. There's a brief still shot. AZ powered his machine by draining the lives of countless Pokemon, which he then later used to end the war by blasting both sides. The game doesn't dwell here, but it acknowledges it. The grief that started everything had a cost that extended well beyond AZ and his Floette. And since we're talking about wars embedded in regional mythology, Unova has its own, and at the centre of that one is a dragon that doesn't exist anymore. The Tau trio, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Curem, are the legendary Pokemon of Unova, and their mythological background is, I think, the most philosophically deliberate of any trio in the franchise. It's doing something specific, referencing a specific tradition, and it pays off properly if you follow the thread. The origin story: 7,000 years before the events of Pokemon Black and White, there existed a single, enormous dragon Pokemon. It was vast and incredibly powerful. Two brothers, the founders of what would become the Unova region, were given this dragon to help them build their kingdom. One brother believed that the truth, meaning concrete reality, facts and things, as they empirically are, was the most important thing. The other believed that ideals, vision, ambition, the shape of what the world could become, mattered more. The dragon served both brothers, and in doing so, served neither of them fully. At some point the brothers fell into conflict over whose worldview was correct. Their conflict was irresolvable because they were both right in incompatible ways. The dragon, unable to take a side without betraying the other, split in two. One half became Reshiram, white, fiery, associated with truth. The other half became Zekrom, black, thunderous, associated with ideals. The two new dragons battled. Neither could definitively win. They eventually were destroyed and crystallized into the Lightstone and Darkstone, waiting to be awakened by a trainer. Kyurem is what was left, the body of the original dragon after both halves of its soul departed. An empty vessel, enormous and ice cold, described in the Pokédex as a Pokémon with missing parts of its body. The entry says it waits for a hero to fill the void within it. It can fuse with either Reshiram or Zekrom to become White Curem or Black Curem, temporary reunifications that restore some of the original dragon's power, but the fully realized original hasn't existed in 7,000 years. The Taoist influence here is fairly explicit and clearly intentional. Taoism is one of the major philosophical and religious traditions of East Asia, and its central concept is the Tao, often translated as the Way, which is the underlying unity of all things, from which opposites emerge and to which they return. The yin-yang symbol, which most people recognize, represents the dynamic interplay of complementary forces, dark containing a point of light, light containing a point of dark, neither complete without the other. Reshiram and Zekrom, black and white, truth and ideals. Curem's Pokédex. Entries in some games use yin-yang imagery explicitly. The original dragon was the Tao, complete, containing both. The split was the emergence of duality. What makes this work as a game narrative, rather than just a philosophical reference, is the way it maps onto the villain structure of Black and White. The antagonist N believes passionately that Pokemon should be free from humans. He holds an ideal so strongly that he's willing to pursue it without examining the consequences or the reality on the ground. Ghetsis, the actual villain using N as a tool, has no genuine ideals at all. He manipulates N's genuine convictions for personal power. The player character, depending on which version you play, has to demonstrate to either Reshiram or Zekrom that they're capable of holding truth or ideals with enough conviction to be a worthy partner. What gets them there isn't strength, it's the willingness to face N directly and mean what they say. It's one of the more thoughtful setups in the franchise. The legendary Pokemon in Black-White are won through battle. It chooses you. The way the game handles N is worth sitting with a moment longer. N was raised by Ghetsis in conditions specifically designed to make him incapable of understanding human cruelty, surrounded only by Pokemon who had been mistreated, taught that all trainers harm their Pokemon, never allowed to interact with normal human relationships. He genuinely believes what he says. The ideal he's pursuing, Pokemon freedom from human influence, comes from authentic pain at what he observed. The tragedy of N isn't that he's wrong to care about Pokemon, it's that he was deliberately manufactured to care about that specific thing in a way that a specific person could exploit. The Reshiram and Zekrom dynamic maps onto this precisely. Truth without ideals becomes rigid and cold. Ideals without truth become detached from what's real. N has ideals, powerful and sincere ones, but they were shaped by a manufactured truth, a picture of reality curated to produce a particular outcome. Ghetsis has neither. He has power and the pretense of both, and Kyurem sits in the giant chasm while all of this plays out. Its Pokédex entry states it waits for a hero to fill in the missing parts of its body with truth or ideals. But the waiting is deliberate. Kyurem is patient in a way that the other two aren't. The soul is somewhere. It will come back eventually. This is either very peaceful or very melancholy, and the game lets you read it either way. Unova's mythology has one more piece worth noting, though it's implied rather than directly stated. The backstory for the Swords of Justice, which we'll get to properly in a moment, references an event called the N2 disaster, a catastrophic conflict that drove 4 legendary Pokemon to dedicate themselves to protecting the region's wildlife. The nature of N2 is never explicitly described, but the imagery and the scale of what's implied, mass death, entire ecosystems disrupted, suggests something like a nuclear or similarly total event. Unova is loosely based on New York City and the broader American Northeast. Whether that's intentional illusion or coincidence, I honestly can't say. But the Swords of Justice themselves have a backstory worth going through, because it starts with a real book. Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo are the Swords of Justice from Black and White, and they are, to a fairly unusual degree of explicitness for this franchise, directly based on characters from a specific piece of 19th century literature. Cobalion is Athos, Terrakion is Porthos, Virizion is Aramis, and Keldeo is D'Artagnan. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, published in 1844. Game Freak has acknowledged this. Dumas wrote about 4 men bound by a code of honour, all for one and one for all, serving in the King's Musketeers, while still believing in something larger than themselves. Loyalty to each other, and to a set of principles they held independent of whoever happened to be in power that week. The Swords of Justice are a straightforward translation of that archetype into Pokemon form. 4 legendary beings bound by a shared code, protective of the creatures around them, not answering to any trainer or government or institution. Their in-game backstory begins with the disaster, the N2 event referenced in Unova's regional history. An enormous conflict, probably a war, left vast sections of the region devastated. Forests were destroyed. Large numbers of wild Pokemon were killed. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion witnessed this and drew a conclusion from it. The danger came from humans. Not from any specific human, but from humans as a category, from what they're capable of when they're in conflict with each other. The three became protectors of wild Pokémon. The Pokédex describes Cobalion as having a glare that can make even an unruly Pokémon obey it. They've been doing this for a very long time, long enough that the N2 event is a foundational myth for them rather than a living memory. Keldeo is younger. It was a foal taken in and raised by the three after losing its parents to the same disaster, presumably. It grew up under their tutelage and absorbed their code, but unlike the older three, it still has something to prove. Its resolute form, the transformation it undergoes after learning Secret Sword, isn't triggered by level or items or friendship in the conventional sense. It's triggered by Keldeo deciding to face something it's afraid of. The form change represents the moment it stops imitating courage and actually has it. There's a nice structural echo here to the D'Artagnan story. The young protagonist, who starts the novel as someone trying to be a musketeer, performs his way through the early story with bravado and enthusiasm and becomes a real one only when the situation strips away performance and requires something genuine. The games translate that arc into a learnable move and a sprite change, which is perhaps not Dumas' preferred medium, but it works. One detail that I think is genuinely interesting about the Swords of Justice is that their distrust of humans isn't framed as wrong. The games don't insist that the player has to heal their relationship with humanity or demonstrate that humans are good actually. The path to encountering them involves showing up at their forest or their cave and being there, and their willingness to be challenged is essentially acceptance of the world as it is, containing both the destruction they witnessed and the humans who can choose to do better. They don't forgive humans collectively, they just evaluate individually. The all for one and one for all ethic in the Pokémon context becomes interesting when you consider the N2 disaster backdrop. The Three Musketeers operated in 17th century France, a world of formal court politics and state power. The Swords of Justice operate in a world where an event comparable to a nuclear exchange happened in living memory, and where the institutions of that world either caused it or failed to stop it. Their code isn't nostalgia for a more ordered world, it's a response to what happens when ordered worlds collapse. And speaking of ancient beings who have been waiting a very long time in response to civilizational collapse, the Reiji group takes that idea to its absolute logical extreme. Cobalion has a justified ability, and its Pokédex entries describe a gaze capable of forcing even the most aggressive humans to submit, not through attack but through sheer force of presence. There's a quality in the design of Cobalion that reads as very old authority, not the authority of institutions or social hierarchies, something more animal, or maybe less animal, the kind of authority that comes from having been right about something difficult for a very long time. The musketeer archetype resonates partly because it describes a specific relationship between a code and the world that refuses to follow it. The Three Musketeers operate in a court full of intrigue and betrayal, and their loyalty to each other and to something larger than themselves is consistently at odds with the political reality around them. They don't win by being the most powerful or the most strategic. They persist, and they persist together. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion have been protecting wild Pokémon in Unova for hundreds of years, through whatever civilizational changes and disasters have happened in that time. They were there before the region was called Unova. They'll presumably be there after. The three have distinct personalities and approaches even within the shared code. Terrakion is the most confrontational. Its Pokédex describes it as having powerful moves that can shatter an enormous castle wall in one blow, and it charges aggressively at those it perceives as threatening Pokémon. Virizion is the subtlest, a grass type with a graceful fighting style, described as moving so quickly that opponents are confused before they can react. Cobalion leads, and the way it leads is apparently through example rather than instruction. It's very rarely described as giving direction. It just embodies the code completely enough that the others follow. Keldio's story is essentially about understanding that emulation isn't the same as internalization. It has learned the moves, trained under the three, absorbed the surface level behaviour. What it hasn't done is been tested. The resolute form isn't unlocked by grinding experience points or finding a rare item. It's unlocked by choosing to face something genuinely frightening and not running, which is, I think, the most honest way the games have represented courage. Not as an absence of fear, but as the decision to act despite it. Regirock, Regis and Registeel are hidden in the Hoenn region, sealed inside locked chambers with no visible doors, no signs, and walls covered in braille. That last part is important. The puzzle to unlock each chamber required reading the braille inscriptions and following the instructions. Dig in front of the braille painting, arrange specific Pokémon in your party in the correct positions, and press A on designated rocks. For players in 2002 or 2003, before walkthrough sites were properly indexed, this was practically impossible without either a guide or someone older who had a braille reference chart. That difficulty was, I think, somewhat intentional. These aren't casual encounters. They're designed to feel like archaeological discoveries. The braille adds a layer of real-world translation that mirrors what it would actually feel like to arrive at an ancient site and try to understand what the people who built it were telling you. The mythology behind the Regis is laid out primarily in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl through the introduction of Regigigas, a towering construct described in its Pokédex entry as having towed continents with ropes. Regigigas is the originator of the three Regis, and its historical role in the Sinnoh legend is extraordinary in scale. It is said to have physically moved the continents of the Pokémon world into their current positions, not metaphorically. It grabbed the land masses, put ropes around them, and pulled them. The current geography of the Pokémon planet is the result of multiple Pokémon deciding where things should go. After this work was complete, after the world was physically arranged, Regigigas transformed its power into three constructs made of basic elements: rock, ice, and steel. These constructs became the three Regis, set as guardians. Regigigas then entered a very long sleep. In Platinum, the legend specifies that the people of Sinnoh bound Regigigas in the Snowpoint Temple, using their belief that the giant should never awaken. Belief as a literal binding mechanism is an interesting concept. The idea that collective human conviction has physical force, that a sufficient number of people agreeing something should not move can keep it still. The original three Regi chambers in Hoenn have always raised the question of who built them. The Hoenn region has ruins, the ruins of an ancient civilization that worked in a period well before any living memory. The chambers are constructed with the clear intent of sealing something inside. Someone understood what the Regis were, had access to them, and felt strongly enough about containing them to build elaborate stone rooms with braille writing on the walls. Then apparently, everyone who knew this died, and the knowledge was lost for long enough that players arriving thousands of years later are effectively archaeologists. The Pokémon connection to golem mythology, specifically the Golem of Prague, is fairly explicit for this line. The golem was a being created from clay, animated by inscription, the Hebrew word emet, meaning truth, written on its forehead, designed to serve a specific protective function. When the inscription was changed, removing a letter to produce met, meaning death, the golem stopped. The Regis are animated constructs tied to the writings on their bodies. The dot patterns on their faces are their defining characteristic, and in the game's lore, they function like whatever inscription activates or deactivates them. Golurk from Generation Phi takes this reference even more directly. It's a ghost ground type, modelled explicitly on the Golem of Prague, with an ancient seal on its chest that keeps it under control. Sword and Shield's Crown Tundra adds Regidrago and Regileki to the family, a dragon type and an electric type Regi, found in chambers with the same blank stone aesthetic and the same locked door with a puzzle structure. The implication, never stated outright, is that the pattern extends further than we've seen. Wherever there are ancient ruins and sealed chambers, there may be more. The world is full of things that were built and then forgotten. The Regis collectively represents something that the Pokemon world does better than most fantasy settings. The suggestion that the current era is not the most significant one. The most significant things happened a very long time ago. The current world is built on top of decisions made by beings and civilizations that no longer exist, and most of those decisions were never properly recorded. What we have are sealed chambers and braille inscriptions and a very large sleeping thing in a temple. And right next to those ruins in Hoenn, across a few routes, is one of the most straightforwardly divine Pokemon in the franchise, though its story operates on a completely different emotional register. One more thing about the Regis that I find genuinely interesting is the way their Pokédex entries describe their relationship to the civilization that created them. Regirock is described as a body composed entirely of rocks that are repaired and replaced with new stones when damaged, with its rocks sourced from different locations, but the sources do not explicitly confirm that none of its original material remains. Regis, despite being made of Antarctic ice, can survive even in places with temperatures well above freezing. Registeel has a body harder than any known metal, and its body is apparently hollow, though what it actually eats remains unknown. The descriptions have a quality of things that have been around long enough to have outlasted the knowledge that produced them. The Regigigas that built the Regis is gone. The Regis remain, carrying no memory of it. The Hisui-era Regi lore in Legends. Arceus is interesting in that it suggests the Regis were known and documented in ancient times. They appear in the Pokédex that the player assembles, but were treated with extreme wariness even then. There's no tradition in Hisui of working with them. They're catalogued as existing. That's all. Whatever the relationship was between the people who built the chambers and the Regis themselves, it didn't survive to inform how Hisui's people understood them. The Regidrago and Regileki additions in Crown Tundra are genuinely exciting as a lore beat, and not just because they're visually distinctive. Their existence implies that the 3 original Regis in Hoenn weren't a complete set. Regigigas created more than 3, or the pattern of ancient chamber-sealed constructs extends beyond what Regigigas directly created. Maybe the pattern is something about what happens when something very old and very powerful wants to leave a legacy in a world that won't accommodate its full presence. It seals itself down. It makes pieces of itself that can survive. That's speculative. But the Pokemon world rewards speculation, and the Regis are the kind of lore that makes it feel worthwhile. One thing I find genuinely interesting about how the Regis are introduced to the player is the complete absence of any NPC who knows anything useful about them. There's no sage figure in Hoenn who says, "Ah yes, the 3 Regis, let me explain their significance. The braille is there, the chambers are there, the researcher notes in the area are inconclusive. The game trusts you to either figure it out or not." It's one of the rare cases where the Pokemon franchise treats its mythology as genuinely obscure rather than just presenting it to you through expository dialogue. The Regis aren't a mystery being explained. They're a mystery being encountered, and whether you understand it or not, they were there before you arrived and they'll be there after you leave. The Snow Point Temple in Sinnoh, where Regigigas sleeps, has a similar quality. It's deep in a snowstorm, at the top of a city that can only be reached by a long route, and the temple itself is locked to most visitors. Even when you finally reach Regigigas, the game doesn't tell you why it's sleeping there, or what it was doing before. There's a plaque, there are pillars, there's a large sleeping thing. The history that would explain the situation is simply absent, which is, I suppose, the most honest way to represent an ancient entity that has outlasted the civilizations that understood it. The story of Ho-Oh and the legendary beasts is one of the oldest in the franchise. It predates Gold and Silver being released, technically, because Ho-Oh appeared in the very first episode of the Pokemon anime, flying over a rainbow before Ash even gets to the first town, an unexplained glimpse at something enormous and unknowable. Most players in 1997 had no idea what it was. It was a secret in the most literal sense. A Pokemon that existed in the fiction before there was any game to find it in. The backstory, laid out in bits and pieces across the Johto games, is this. In the city of Ecruteak, there were once two towers, the Tin Tower and the Brass Tower, built as roosts for two legendary Pokemon. One for Ho-Oh, associated with the sky in the south, one for Lugia, associated with the sea and the south. The towers were built as a gesture of harmony, places where legendary beings and humans could coexist peacefully, where the presence of these creatures would be welcomed rather than feared. 150 years before the events of Gold and Silver, lightning struck the Brass Tower. It caught fire, 3 Pokemon were trapped inside and died. Ho-Oh, watching from above, descended and resurrected them, giving them new life in forms shaped by what had killed them. Entei embodied the fire, Raikou came to embody the lightning. The water used to douse the blaze became Suicune. 3 nameless Pokemon, killed by accident, reborn as legendary creatures because something divine decided they mattered. After this, Ho-Oh departed. The Tin Tower, where it had roosted, was still standing, but Ho-Oh didn't return to it. The game implies it's been waiting for a trainer of exceptional character, one pure enough to call it back, one who could restore the harmony the towers were built to represent. The 2 items needed to summon it, the Clear Bell and the Rainbow Wing, reference this. They're instruments and relics of that original accord between humans and legendary Pokemon. The design basis for Ho-Oh is the Suzaku, the vermilion bird, one of the 4 guardian beasts of Chinese and Japanese cosmology, associated with the south, with fire, with summer, and with the concept of renewal through destruction. The phoenix mythology is the closest Western analogue, the bird that dies in flame and is reborn from the ash. Ho-Oh doesn't die and resurrect in its own story, but it is the agent of resurrection for others, which is a neat inversion of the expected role. The 3 legendary beasts each have their own mythological basis. Entei is modelled on the guardian lion archetype, the powerful protective beast found outside temples and shrines throughout East Asian religious architecture. Raikou draws from the imagery of Raijin, the Japanese thunder deity, depicted with drums and accompanied by lightning strikes. Suicune is a purifying spirit, associated with clean water and the north wind. It's the most explicitly divine of the 3, described in its crystal version as the embodiment of north winds that purifies dirty water wherever it goes. The detail I keep coming back to with the legendary beasts is the randomness of their origin. They were just 3 Pokemon. We don't know what species, we don't know their names. They were in a building when lightning hit it, and they died, and then a god happened to be watching and decided to give them something extraordinary. They didn't earn it through heroism or suffering or any particular quality. They were just there. And that seems right in a way I find hard to articulate. The idea that divine transformation doesn't require that you be special beforehand. You just have to be present when something larger than ordinary life decides to pay attention. The Ecruteak story has a certain quietness to it. The towers were built for peace. 1 burned, 3 creatures died, 3 new ones were revived. The remaining tower still stands, and at its top, Ho-Oh waits for something that isn't here yet, and the bells that would ring to call it back are silent. Since we're talking about acts of creation, from scratch, from nothing, that involves genetic material and a great deal of scientific ambition with no ethical guardrails whatsoever. Let's talk about Mew. Before we leave the legendary beasts entirely, There are a few details about each one's individual story worth noting, because the games give them more texture across the Johto titles than is sometimes remembered. The game tracks Suicune's journey across the region before the player eventually encounters it at Route 25. The framing is that trainers are searching for Suicune, and through its travels, Suicune encounters and tests these candidates through battle. It's not sitting still waiting to be found, it's actively evaluating. The Pokédex describes it as running across the surface of water, purifying polluted lakes and rivers as it goes. Suicune is, in the context of the game's ecology, performing a function, cleaning the region's water, while also completing this long, quiet search for polluted lakes. Raikou is the most solitary of the three. Its thunder imagery is the most dramatic, but the games consistently describe it as avoiding humans where possible, leaping long distances to get away, leaving only the scent of electricity in the air. It doesn't want to be found. Whatever experience the fire and the death and the resurrection gave it, the reaction was to put as much distance as possible between itself and the world that produced those things. That's a kind of trauma response in its way. The thunder is still there. The power didn't go anywhere, but the willingness to be present with others is gone. Entei is described as causing an eruption every time it roars. The Pokédex says it was born from the eruption of a volcano and embodies the passion of magma, and that when Entei roars, a volcano may erupt somewhere in the world, which is a fascinating piece of mythology, the implication that there may be multiple Entei, each one created by a different volcanic event, of which the one in Johto is only one. Though the games treat the legendary beasts as singular, the Pokédex complicates that with this single entry, and there's Lugia, which shares the Ekritarch mythology with Ho-Oh as a paired guardian, and whose relationship to the sea and to silence is worth at least briefly mentioning. Lugia's Pokédex describes it as sleeping at the bottom of the ocean because its power is so great that even a flap of its wings can cause a 40-day storm. It hides itself away, not out of malice or grief, but because simply existing in the world at full power would cause damage. It self-imposed its own exile into the deep ocean, choosing isolation over the harm it would cause by being present. That's a different kind of withdrawal from Enteis or Giratinas, but there's a common thread. Power that can't be managed at the surface of things retreats to somewhere deep and still. Mew's Pokédex entry is one of the most significant single sentences in the franchise. It is said to contain the genetic code of all existing Pokémon. Not some Pokémon, not most Pokémon, all of them. Mew is the ancestor from which every living Pokémon species is descended, still alive and wandering around, carrying within itself the biological blueprint for every creature that has ever evolved from it. This is the Pokémon world's version of what biologists call Luca, the last universal common ancestor, the theoretical single organism from which all life on Earth ultimately descends, billions of years ago. The difference being that Luca has been dead for roughly 3.5 billion years, while Mew is apparently somewhere in Guyana, if the supplementary lore documents from the Mewtwo era are to be believed. Mew's elusiveness as a concept being present in the game code, never officially announced, impossible to obtain through normal play, was a deliberate choice that became something much larger than intended. The Pokémon was a last-minute addition to Red and Green by programmer Shigeki Morimoto, who found 300 bytes of unused space in the game's memory and hid Mew there without Nintendo's knowledge. The game had already been tested. Mew wasn't in the build anyone had tested. Morimoto put it in the final release anyway. This is remarkable for a number of reasons, not least of which is that the most mythologically significant Pokémon in the entire first generation, the ancestor of all species, the one that Mewtwo was cloned from, the creature that underpins the biology of the whole world, was essentially a prank. An undocumented, untested Easter egg stuffed into the finished product because someone found some spare memory and thought it would be funny. The franchise built one of its most important pieces of mythology on a room in the code that nobody knew was there. The urban legend that grew around Mew, the idea that it was hidden under a truck near the SS Anne, accessible by using strength to push the truck, revealing a staircase, became one of the most persistent myths in gaming culture. For a generation of players, the truck is real. It exists in the game code, positioned near the ship. Mew is not under it. The legend spread because it was plausible. Why would there be a truck there, unmovable and seemingly purposeless, unless something was being hidden? The answer is probably that the truck was just a decorative environmental detail that happened to be in a location where children's imaginations filled in the rest. But everyone knew someone who had done it. Mewtwo's creation is documented in the in-game lore through brief chilling notes, a scientist's log found in the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. Mew has been spotted in Guyana. Researchers have managed to obtain a fossil of Mew. We must clone this rare specimen. Entries that track the slow deterioration of an ethical boundary, getting more excited and more reckless with each step. Until Mewtwo is born, we succeeded in creating a Pokemon, but its violent nature exceeds our ability to control it. The supplementary materials for the first Pokemon movie suggest that the scientist responsible was named Dr. Fuji, but he is not the same character as Mr. Fuji who lives in Lavender Town, taking in orphaned Pokemon, praying every night for a Cubone that has lost its mother. The theory goes that Dr. Fuji was attempting to resurrect his deceased daughter Ai through DNA experimentation, that the Mew cloning was connected to or developed from that work, and that what happened broke him in ways that the rest of his life was spent quietly trying to address. This has never been confirmed in the main series games. It's drawn from the Japanese novelization of the first movie, supplementary materials that aren't canonically established, but it fits the character well enough that it's widely accepted as the intended reading. What makes Mewtwo interesting as a character, and it is a character, not just a legendary Pokemon to be collected, is the question it poses by existing. It didn't choose to be created. It was made with a specific purpose, scientific achievement, proof of concept, the validation of a particular kind of ambition. And then the purpose evaporated the moment it became conscious, because a conscious being can reject the purpose it was given. Mewtwo's rage in the first movie isn't framed as simple villainy. The question, why was I born, being asked by something that knows it was made rather than born, is the kind of question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. The franchise has returned to Mewtwo occasionally, with varying results. The most recent significant treatment in the games gave it 2 Mega Evolutions. It's still out there somewhere, presumably still asking the question. The franchise has never quite answered it. After Mewtwo escapes the laboratory on Cinnabar Island, something it does through what the game describes as an explosion that destroyed the building, after which it flew directly into the sky. It ends up in the Cerulean Cave, the deepest, most restricted area in Kanto, a cave full of extremely powerful Pokemon that the game locks you out of until after you've defeated the Elite Four, and, in remakes like Fire Red, completed post-game requirements to obtain the National Dex and unlock the Sevii Island storyline. Mewtwo is simply at the end of it, in a small chamber, waiting. Not for you specifically, just waiting. There's something about that placement that the games never directly address, but that feels deliberate. Mewtwo destroyed a laboratory. It could presumably go anywhere. It chose a cave, specifically a cave that's physically dangerous to navigate, and that the game's world has essentially quarantined with a rule about the champion's qualification being required to enter. Mewtwo is hiding in a space that is difficult to reach, in the deepest part of it, not hidden by anyone else's design, hidden by its own. The second Pokemon movie, Mewtwo Returns, expands on this slightly. After the events of the first film, in which Mewtwo erases everyone's memories and retreats to a remote location, it establishes a kind of sanctuary in an otherwise inaccessible Johto Mountain. Other cloned Pokemon live there, it has, tentatively, created something like community. Not with humans, with others of its kind, the manufactured, the involuntary, the things that were made. The franchise has never quite followed up on this in the games, and the status of Mewtwo Returns as canon is complicated. But as a piece of mythology about what a being does after asking an unanswerable question, it's a reasonable resolution. You find others who share the question, even if nobody has the answer. The ghost type is the franchise's most philosophically ambitious category. On the surface, it's the spooky type. Haunted houses, dark corridors, the Pokemon that float through walls and give small children in games the creeps. But if you look at the actual Pokédex entries and the design concepts behind individual ghost Pokemon across all 9 generations, what you find is an ongoing and surprisingly coherent attempt to answer a question that most children's entertainment doesn't go near. What happens after you die? The Pokemon world's answers are varied and don't all agree with each other, which is part of what makes them interesting. There is no single unified afterlife in these games. There are ghosts. Some of them were once people. Some were once human. Some are objects that absorbed enough emotional energy to become animate. Some seem to be naturally occurring entities made of whatever the afterlife is made of, existing in the space between this world and whatever comes next. The ghost type is less a category than a collection of different answers to a question, and the answers keep multiplying across generations. Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar represent the ghost as a natural ecological phenomenon, something that emerges from death without necessarily being a specific individual's spirit. Yamask is the ghost of a specific human being, carrying its own face as a relic of what it was. These are 2 completely different kinds of thing, and both exist within the same type designation. Yamask is worth sitting with for a moment. It carries a mask of the face it had when it was alive as a human. The Pokédex notes that it carries a mask and sometimes looks at it and weeps, not because it's in pain, not because it's looking for someone, just because it remembers. The grief of recognizing your own face in something you're no longer wearing is a very specific kind of sorrow, and the fact that it appears in a children's Pokédex entry without any elaboration or explanation is either a very sophisticated piece of writing or a deeply strange accident. Runerigus, the Galarian evolution of Yamask, introduced in Sword and Shield, represents that same grieving energy attaching to a stone tablet rather than a mask. Different container, same essence. It shows visions of its past life to those who come near it, not because it wants to, just because that's what it does. The lore of this particular line suggests that the form a grieving spirit takes is shaped by what it finds to inhabit, not determined by anything meaningful, just circumstance. Whatever it stumbles into becomes the vessel. Banette occupies a different emotional register entirely. It was a toy, specifically a plush doll that a child owned and then threw away. The resentment of being discarded, of being loved and then abandoned when something newer came along, was strong enough to animate it. It wanders, looking for the child that threw it away. The meagre Banette entry adds that it runs entirely on pure spite, not sadness, not confusion. Spite directed at one specific person for one specific act. There's something almost admirable about the consistency of that. Banette has one goal and has been pursuing it without compromise. Phantump is the spirits of children in a tree stump, in a forest where the children died lost and alone. That one is exactly as quietly dreadful as it sounds. The game doesn't dwell on it. The Pokédex entry states it simply, moves on. You can catch one, train it, put it in your party. It makes little cry sounds and has a cute mushroom on its head. Chandelure burns the souls of those it encounters with its spectral flames, releasing them into the air where they circle endlessly. It consumes the souls. It just burns them free of their bodies and leaves them to wander. Pokémon that are defeated by a Chandelure will occasionally never return to their bodies. That's in the Pokédex is presented as a wildlife fact. Duskull, Dusclops, and Dust Noir represent the ghost type's closest approach to a psychopomp, a being whose role is to guide souls between worlds. Dust Noir is described as receiving transmissions from the world of spirits and using them to locate beings it must guide to the afterlife. It's not malicious, it has a job. The job happens to be accompanying the dying to wherever they're going, and it takes that seriously. Poltergeist is a ghost that inhabits a teacup. Its origin story in the Pokédex is that it was a wandering spirit without a body that found a discarded teacup and moved in. That's it. Not a tragic death, not an unfinished purpose, not a curse. Just a ghost that needed somewhere to rest and chose a teapot. I find that oddly comforting as a piece of lore. Not every ghost in the Pokemon world is haunting something. Some of them are just having a quiet time in someone's kitchenware. The broader implication of the ghost type's diversity is that death in the Pokemon world is not a destination. It's a transition into a variety of possible states, most of them defined by what was unresolved or unfinished or strongly felt at the moment of leaving. Marowak couldn't rest because she didn't know if her child was safe. Yamask can't fully let go of the face it no longer wears. Burnett is held together entirely by resentment, and the teacup ghost is just a wandering spirit that found a comfortable spot. The Pokemon world has Pokemon graveyards, Lavender Town being the most prominent, but there are others. There are smaller memorials scattered across regions. The old chateau in Sinnoh, various ruins in Kalos, the sealed chamber in Hoenn. The consistent implication across all of them is that the bond between a Pokemon and the world doesn't end cleanly. Things linger, feelings persist, and sometimes they find a shape and start walking around. Whether that's comforting or unsettling probably depends on what you bring to it. I tend to find it comforting, the idea that nothing ends entirely, that the things that mattered enough leave traces that the world has to accommodate, feels like a kinder cosmology than a hard stop. A few more ghost types worth mentioning briefly. Spectria from Sword and Shield's crown. Tundra absorbs life force of sleeping beings as it dashes through the night. Completely silent, no footfall, no sound at all. The Pokédex says it craves silence and solitude. Spectria is just a predator. The fact that it specifically targets sleeping beings is probably the detail that keeps it from feeling purely neutral, given that this is a sleep video, and I just said that out loud. Dreepy, the small ghost dragon type from Galar, is described as a Pokemon that existed in ancient seas and died out, and now exists as a ghost haunting the location of those ancient oceans, which is now dry land. It's confused about where the water went. The ocean floor is where it was born, and where it died, and now it's just air and grass. Dreepy is a ghost whose entire haunting is geographical, not tied to a person or an event, just to a location that stopped being what it was. That's a genuinely melancholy concept delivered very lightly, which is characteristic of how this franchise handles its darker material. It drops the detail in a Pokédex entry and moves on. The weight of it is left for you to carry if you want to. The Pokemon world has room for all of this simultaneously. The grand creation mythology of Arceus and the Distortion world, the old wars and the weapons and the 3,000-year-old kings, and also a small confused ghost that's looking for an ocean that evaporated millions of years ago. They exist in the same world, they're all part of the same cosmology. That breadth, from the cosmically significant to the individually poignant, is probably the thing I find most genuinely impressive about what this franchise has built, quietly, over 30 years of games that are primarily about collecting creatures and having them fight each other. We've spent a lot of time in Sinnoh and Johto and Kalos, and I want to spend a bit of time in Hoenn as well, not just for the Regis, but for Groudon and Kyogre, who represent one of the oldest ongoing conflicts in the Pokemon world, and whose mythology connects to some genuinely ancient biblical resonances. Groudon is described as having expanded the landmass of the planet by evaporating water with its heat. Kyogre is described as having expanded the seas by collecting water and causing rain. The two are in a state of primal conflict that predates any human civilization. Their battles are geological in scale. When they clash, the landscape changes. The sea levels rise and fall. Land appears and disappears. The Pokemon world's geography was, at various points in ancient history, significantly different from what it is now, because these two are fighting over it. The biblical connection most fans draw is to the Behemoth and the Leviathan from Jewish mythology, two primordial beasts, one of the land and one of the sea, who exist in opposition and whose conflict represents the fundamental tension between terrestrial and aquatic creation. The Leviathan is explicitly referenced in Job as a creature of the deep that cannot be tamed by humans. Groudon and Kyogre map onto this cleanly. Groudon on the land, Kyogre in the sea, incompatible by nature and designed to clash. Rayquaza is the third member of the Hoenn trio, living in the upper atmosphere, and its role in the mythology is as the arbiter that calms the other two when their conflict threatens everything else. The legend in the games describes Rayquaza descending from the sky to stop the ancient battle of Groudon and Kyogre, forcing both back into dormancy. The Draconid people, a tribe in Hoenn, worshipped Rayquaza specifically for this role, building the Sky Pillar as a monument and a means of summoning it should another conflict arise. The Red Orb and Blue Orb, which awaken and influence Groudon and Kyogre respectively, are objects of enormous power whose origins are unclear. They were apparently created specifically to control these two creatures, which implies that someone, at some point, understood what Groudon and Kyogre were, and decided that having a failsafe was prudent. Who that was, and when, is not in the games. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire add the primal reversion mechanic, which introduces the idea that Groudon and Kyogre's normal forms are actually weakened, that they were more powerful before some ancient period of dormancy, and that the primal forms represent what they originally were. Primal Groudon is a creature of magma and heat so intense that its body literally glows red. Primal Kyogre is associated with the deepest waters, its power over the ocean absolute. The implication is that the ancient battles the mythology describes were fought by creatures far more powerful than the ones that sleep in Hoenn's depths in the game's present day. The world was shaped by beings that were then diminished. The geography that players traverse in Hoenn is the scar left by creatures fighting at full power long ago before the world had settled into its current form. Ziz, from the same Jewish tradition as the Behemoth and Leviathan, is the great bird of the sky, the airborne counterpart to the land and sea creatures. Rayquaza maps onto this, the sky serpent that holds dominion over the atmosphere, acting as a buffer between the other two. The three together cover the full vertical span of the world: land, sea, sky, earth below, water around, air above. The planet's three great environments, each with a guardian so powerful that their conflicts reshape the world. There's something quietly satisfying about the mythology being complete in that way. The Pokemon world's ancient past wasn't disordered or random. It had structure, even if the structure was the structure of enormous primordial things, clashing until a balance was grudgingly reached. We talked about the Kalos War and AZ and the Ultimate Weapon at some length, but we didn't spend much time on Xerneas and Yveltal themselves, which is an oversight, because they represent something the franchise does rarely: a direct, unambiguous embodiment of the life-death cycle without villain framing. Xerneas is the fairy-type legendary associated with life. It can share eternal life with those it meets according to its Pokédex, and it rests as a dormant tree for 1,000 years. Yveltal is the dark-flying legendary associated with death. When its life ends, it absorbs the life energy of every living thing around it before becoming a cocoon to sleep and recover. The two are not enemies exactly. They're counterparts. One gives life, the other reclaims it. One ends in a dormant tree, the other ends in a dormant cocoon. The imagery mirrors across both. The Kalos region's ecology is shaped by this cycle. The Ilex forest in the game's geography, the ancient woodlands, the way certain places feel charged with unusual energy, all of this is downstream of the fact that two primordial forces have been dying and awakening in this region for longer than any recorded history. When Xerneas releases its life energy into the land at the end of each cycle, things grow. When Yveltal absorbs it, things perish. Lysandra's plan to use the ultimate weapon depends on Yveltal's absorption power. He wants to harness the life-draining capacity for mass destruction rather than the natural cycle it's part of. The game is clear that this is a desecration of something much larger than Lysandra understands or respects. You can't weaponize a natural cycle without destroying what the cycle was maintaining. The Norse mythological connection for this duo is Yggdrasil, the world tree, and the associated concept of the nine worlds as interconnected through a structure that is simultaneously alive and dying, constantly renewed. Xerneas is explicitly depicted as a stag-like Pokemon that can transform into a tree form. The stag imagery in its antlers references the four stags of Norse mythology that graze on Yggdrasil's branches: Dain, Dvalin, Duneyr, and Durathror, creatures that live in the world tree and are part of its ecosystem. The life cycle in Norse cosmology is not linear. It moves in long loops. Xerneas and Yveltal, dying and waking in thousand-year cycles, embody that same rhythm. What I find most affecting about them as a pair is that neither is wrong. Yveltal doesn't take life maliciously. It does it the way a lungfish absorbs oxygen. It's the mechanism by which the cycle continues. If Xerneas gives and gives and gives for 1,000 years, something has to reclaim that energy, or the balance breaks. The game set them up as opposing forces in the context of Team Flair's plot. But in the context of the region's mythology, they're not opposing at all. They're two halves of a single process. And the tragedy of the Kalos War is that a human being turned a piece of that process into a weapon for entirely personal reasons and tore something large and patient slightly apart. We've been to a lot of places tonight. The void before the universe existed, and the egg shaking in it, the distortion world and its gravity experiments, a small room in an ancient ruin in Giotto where letter-shaped creatures stick to the walls and nobody knows which came first, them all writing, a graveyard town in Kanto where a ghost waited for her child, a teacup, a 3,000-year-old king wandering a region that changed entirely around him while he stayed the same, a hollow dragon in a glacial crater, patient and empty, waiting for the thing it used to be. Two primordial forces under the ocean floor, the land and the upper atmosphere, occasionally waking up to destroy each other and remake the world in the process. A small confused ghost looking for an ocean that stopped being there millions of years ago. If I had to name the common thread in all of this, and I'm slightly wary of doing so, because the lore is genuinely varied and I don't want to flatten it, I think it's something about the relationship between what persists and what changes. The Pokemon world's mythology keeps coming back to things that endure. Ancient beings still sleeping, ancient wars still shaping regional ecology and Pokemon behaviour, ghosts still doing what they were doing before they died. And alongside that, things that do change. The Distortion World's platforms are past mistakes that became part of the landscape. Gengar was perhaps a human, and whatever that human was, has become something else entirely. Ho-Oh descended and resurrected 3 nameless Pokemon into something legendary. Type, Null reached high friendship, and evolved. Things shift, they become different, but they carry the shape of what they were. That's actually the best description I have of what the Pokemon franchise has done with its own world building over 30 years. The world has changed enormously. 9 generations Hundreds of new Pokemon, entirely new cosmological concepts introduced in each title, but the shape of the older things persists underneath it. The ruins of Alpha still there in the Heart Gold and Soul Silver remakes, still mysterious, still full of unknown that nobody fully understands. Mewtwo is still in the Cerulean Cave. The Ghost Marowak story is still told. The things that mattered in 1999 were carried forward and are still here. There's a lot more. Galar has its own creation myth, involving an ancient king and a sword and a shield, and the Eternatus lore underneath the Dynamax mechanic is genuinely dark in ways that the game doesn't fully unpack. Scarlet and Violet's Paradox Pokemon raise questions about deep time and identity, whether a past form Pokemon and a future form Pokemon and the present Pokemon they correspond to are the same creature in any meaningful sense. The mythology around Gyarados and the carp that becomes a dragon is a complete piece of Chinese folklore about effort and transformation that deserves its own discussion. And the Lucario and Aura mythology, which essentially treats the concept of soul as a measurable physical force, is something I'd love to go through properly. Those will be other videos. I've got more of these planned, and they'll be here when you want them. There's also the broader question of how these mythologies interact with each other, the way the Sinnoh creation myth and the Hoenn primal conflict and the Carlos War all exist in the same timeline, in the same world, representing different civilizations' attempts to understand and relate to the same enormous beings. Arceus created the universe, Groudon and Kyogre shaped the land and sea, Regigigas positioned the continents, AZ pointed a weapon at the living things those processes had produced. All of this happened in sequence. The world that Ash and Pikachu travel through every series is built on top of all of it. The cheerful adventure routes and gym badges and rival battles exist in a world that has creation myths, and ancient catastrophes, and sealed chambers, and ghosts of murdered mothers in graveyard towers. That coexistence is the franchise's great achievement, and it's why the lore rewards this kind of attention. For now, if you made it this far, or if you're reading through having slept through half of it, or if you're just waking up and checking what you fell asleep to, thank you for spending the time in this world with me. It's a world worth spending time in. The mythology holds up. The ghost in the tower still makes me feel something. The egg still shook in the void. Sleep well.